For 18 years, I lived a double life. By day, I was Harold Mitchell, struggling single father, penny-pinching accountant, the man who taught his daughter to clip coupons and work 3 jobs to afford community college. But every Wednesday at 4 a.m., I would slip away to a secret destination, a sprawling mansion with marble floors and a grand piano, a house that legally belonged to my daughter, though she'd never even seen it. I thought I was protecting her. I believed I was building her character, until the day she discovered the truth and served me with legal papers, suing her own father for emotional damage. What she didn't know, what neither of us knew, was that we were both pawns in a revenge plot decades in the making, orchestrated by the one person who should have loved us most. Follow my channel for more heart-wrenching true stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, trust, and the price of good intentions. Like and comment to let me know where you're watching from, and share your thoughts. Would you ever forgive a parent who lied to you for your entire life? My name is Harold Mitchell, and for 18 years, my daughter believed we were poor. It's strange how life's biggest lies start with the smallest decisions. For me, it began with those pre-dawn drives every Wednesday, when the rest of Millfield was still wrapped in darkness and dreams. At exactly 4 a.m., I would slip out of our cramped 2-bedroom rental on Oak Street, the one with the peeling wallpaper and the radiator that hissed and sputtered all winter long. I'd carefully close the door, wincing at every creak that might wake Marlene. She was always a light sleeper, even as a child. One sound and those intelligent eyes would snap open, asking questions I couldn't answer. I still remember how my heart would pound as I'd slide into my rusted Chevy, the car I deliberately kept despite having the means for something better. The engine would groan in protest as I turned the key, and I'd hold my breath until I was safely down the block. The 47-minute drive to Westbrook Hills was a journey between worlds. From our neighborhood of chain-link fences and second-hand furniture to a place where fountains sparkled and marble gleamed. As the miles passed, I'd rehearse the same old justifications in my head. It's for her own good. She'll understand someday. But would she? Would anyone? The first time I saw what was really mine, what was legally hers, I nearly turned around. A white colonial mansion with Roman columns and arched windows that caught the morning light like diamonds. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a library filled with first editions, a grand piano in the ballroom that nobody played. My inheritance, my silent prison. I'd park around back, where neighbors couldn't see. Using the service entrance key, I'd slip inside like a thief into my own property. Only then would I turn on the lights, just the interior ones, never anything that might shine through the windows. The cleaning service came monthly, but I still dusted. Still ran my fingers along the mahogany banisters and marble countertops. Still checked the plumbing and the electrical systems. Sometimes, I'd sit at that grand piano in the empty ballroom. I never learned to play properly, but I'd press one key, middle C, just to hear something human echo through all that emptiness. Just one note, and then silence again. By 6 a.m. I'd be gone, everything locked up tight, every light extinguished, every trace of my presence erased. Back on the highway before sunrise, rushing to be home before Marlene's alarm went off for school. "Where were you?" she asked once when she was 14. I'd come home to find her sitting at our chipped Formica kitchen table, dark circles under her eyes. "Couldn't sleep," I lied. "Went for a drive to clear my head." She studied me with those eyes, her mother's eyes, that seemed to strip away pretense. "You do that a lot," she said softly. The guilt was a physical thing then, a stone lodged in my throat, but I swallowed it down like I always did. "Work stress," I said, and busied myself making the cheap instant coffee she thought was all we could afford. You might think I was insane. Some nights, staring at the ceiling of our small rental, listening to the neighbors argue through paper-thin walls, I wondered the same thing. But it wasn't madness. It was a promise. A promise I made to my mother on her deathbed, her bony fingers digging into my wrist with surprising strength as she pulled me close. Her voice was a harsh whisper by then, but her words were crystal clear. Never let a single penny fall into that spoiled girl's hands. Not 1 cent until she's of age. Promise me, Harold. She meant Marlene, of course, my only child. The product of my marriage to a woman my mother hated until her dying breath. At the time, I convinced myself I was protecting Marlene. From what? From becoming entitled. From losing her work ethic. from turning into the kind of person who expected the world handed to her on a silver platter. That's what I told myself in those pre-dawn hours when I'd return from the mansion and watch my daughter sleeping in her tiny bedroom, where the ancient heating system rattled and the ceiling leaked when it rained hard. I told myself I was building her character, teaching her values, making her strong. But now, 18 years later, as I stare at the envelope she sent, the court summons inside, the formal letterhead of Slater and Associates, the words emotional damage and deliberate deprivation leaping off the page, I know the truth. I didn't protect anything. I destroyed something more precious than money could ever replace. Trust, the kind you can never buy back once it's gone. The summons trembles in my hand as I sit alone in our modest living room. Tomorrow I'll have to face her across a courtroom. My daughter, now a grown woman who discovered that while she worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college, while she wore secondhand clothes and counted pennies for textbooks, while she believed we were one missed rent payment away from homelessness, a mansion sat empty with her name on the deed. A mansion I visited every Wednesday at 4 a.m., just to touch the life I denied us both. The day my mother died was the day guilt was born in me. Not the fleeting kind that fades with time, but the kind that grows roots and wraps itself around your insides until breathing itself becomes an act of remembrance. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of autumn day where the sunlight turns golden and slants through trees that haven't quite decided to surrender their leaves. I remember watching that light filter through the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Church, casting colored shadows across my mother's mahogany casket. The pews were mostly empty. Eleanor Mitchell hadn't been what you'd call beloved in our community. My daughter Marlene, just 15 then, sat beside me in a black dress we'd found at Goodwill the day before. Too big in the shoulders, too short at the hem. She hadn't shed a tear during the service. Neither had I. Our grief, if that's what it was, had calcified into something harder, something unrecognizable even to ourselves. She never liked me much, did she? Marlene whispered as the organist played the final hymn. I squeezed her hand. Another lie forming. She just didn't know how to show affection. The truth was far uglier. My mother had despised Marlene from the moment she was born, calling her that woman's spawn, rather than her granddaughter. That woman being Catherine, my wife, who'd left us when Marlene was just 4. Left for reasons I still couldn't bring myself to explain to our daughter. After the sparse funeral reception, cucumber sandwiches and weak coffee in the church basement, we met with my mother's attorney, Richard Keller. He was a contemporary of my mother's with thinning gray hair and bifocals that kept sliding down his nose. His office smelled of leather-bound books and the menthol lozenges he constantly unwrapped. "Let's get down to business," he said, not unkindly. "Marlene, would you prefer to wait outside?" "She stays," I said firmly. "Whatever concerns me concerns her." He nodded, then produced a thick document bound in blue leather, my mother's last will and testament. He cleared his throat and began reading in that measured voice lawyers cultivate, like priests intoning Latin. The first few minutes were standard legal jargon. Then came the heart of it, the part that would shape the next 18 years of our lives. "To my son Harold I bequeath all property, financial assets and holdings detailed in Appendix A, with the following condition." Here Keller paused and glanced at me over his glasses. Something like pity flashed in his eyes. "The will shall only be valid if Harold never transfers directly or indirectly any value, property or assets to his granddaughter while she is a minor. Should Harold violate this condition, all assets will revert to the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation for the Arts." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its ticking. "What does that mean?" Marlene asked, her voice small. Keller addressed her directly. "It means, young lady, that your father inherits everything, but he cannot give any of it to you until you turn 18. Not money for college, not property, nothing substantial." "That's ridiculous," I said, feeling heat rise to my face. "She's my daughter. I can provide for her however I see fit." Keller shook his head. "I'm afraid the will is quite clear. Eleanor was—" He searched for a diplomatic word. "Determined about this matter." "Can we contest it?" I asked. "You could try, but Eleanor consulted 3 separate legal experts to ensure this would hold up in court. It would be a costly battle with slim chances of success." I looked at Marlene, expecting to see hurt or confusion. Instead, I saw something worse. Resignation. As if she'd always known her grandmother's hatred ran this deep. What Keller didn't mention then, what I would only discover later that day in private, was the cruelest twist in my mother's posthumous game. The mansion on Willow Creek Drive, the crown jewel of her estate, had technically been placed in Marlene's name when she was just 4 years old. A fact my mother had kept hidden from both of us. It's a trust arrangement, Keller explained later in hushed tones. The property is in her name, but she cannot access, inhabit, or benefit from it until her 18th birthday. If you tell her about it, if you take her there, if you use any resources from the estate to benefit her directly, you trigger the reversal clause. She locked us both out, I whispered, realization dawning. Essentially, Keller admitted, it was her way of ensuring you wouldn't what? Become too soft with the girl, he said, using my mother's own words. Eleanor believed your ex-wife was only after the family money. She was convinced the daughter would be the same. I remember standing by the window of his office watching evening traffic crawl along Main Street, regular people heading home to regular lives, unburdened by toxic wealth and the poison it breeds in families. So what do? I asked. Tell Marlene we're rich but can't touch a penny, or live as if we're not. Keller didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost its professional detachment. Eleanor Mitchell was my client for 40 years, Harold. I watched her grow bitter and isolated, clutching her money like it was a shield against the world. Don't let her do the same to you and your daughter from beyond the grave. I nodded, but already my mind was calculating. 18 minus 15. 3 years. We could live modestly for 3 more years. I could protect Marlene from knowing just how much her grandmother had hated her. Or so I thought. What I couldn't have known then, sitting in that leather chair with the weight of inherited wealth and inherited hatred pressing down on me, was that secrets have a way of surfacing. Like bodies in a lake, they always rise. And when they do, they bring something far worse than the truth would have. They bring betrayal. Time has a funny way of slipping through your fingers when you're living a lie. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, and before you know it, years have passed. The small deceptions you told yourself were temporary have calcified into a permanent structure, a house of cards you dare not disturb. For 3 years after my mother's funeral, our life settled into a rhythm. Marlene finished high school with honors, despite working evenings at the local diner. I continued my job as an accountant at Wilson & Associates, a small firm that handled taxes for local businesses. We lived in our modest rental, drove our aging car, and counted pennies at the grocery store, all while millions sat untouched in accounts I visited in secret. Every Wednesday at dawn, I still made my pilgrimage to the mansion. It became a ritual I couldn't abandon, partly to maintain the property, partly as penance. I'd wander through rooms that belonged to my daughter but that she'd never seen. Sometimes I'd bring a small repair tool, fix a loose cabinet hinge, or touch up paint on a windowsill. Caretaking was the only honest thing I could do in that house of lies. By Marlene's 18th birthday, I had it all planned out. We'd drive to the mansion together. I'd hand her the keys and explain everything: the inheritance, the condition, the waiting. I rehearsed my speech 100 times during those solitary dawn visits. I imagined her initial shock followed by understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. But life rarely follows the scripts we write for it. 2 months before her 18th birthday, Marlene started her freshman year at Westfield Community College. She'd won a partial scholarship but still worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. Her academic advisors suggested she explore research opportunities to strengthen her transfer applications to 4-year universities. I'm thinking of majoring in urban planning, she told me over our usual Thursday night dinner of spaghetti, with sauce from the jar that was always on sale. Mrs. Lieberman says I should start by researching local property records, get a feel for how the town developed. I nodded, twirling pasta around my fork, unaware that this innocent comment was the first tremor of an earthquake about to shatter our lives. The Millfield Public Library was housed in a Victorian building downtown, its research room filled with microfiche readers and county records dating back to the town's founding. For weeks, Marlene spent her precious free hours there, poring over plat maps and property transfers. I remember that Tuesday clearly, October 17th. Cold rain lashed against the windows of our apartment as I heated soup on the stove. When the door opened, I called out with my usual, "How was your day?" But there was no answer. Marlene stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, clutching a manila folder to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused. Water dripped from her hair onto the linoleum floor, forming a small puddle she didn't seem to notice. "Marlene? What's wrong? Are you sick?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to our small kitchen table and carefully set down the folder as if it contained explosives. With deliberate movements, she opened it and withdrew several photocopied pages. "I was researching the Westbrook Hills development," she said, her voice eerily calm, "looking at property values and ownership patterns for my project." My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming before she said it. "And I found this." She slid a document across the table. It was a property record. At the top, in official type, Marlene Catherine Mitchell, legal owner. Below it, the address of the mansion. And at the bottom, a note about the trust arrangement, with my name listed as trustee until her 18th birthday. "What is this?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Her eyes, those perceptive eyes that had always seen through me, were fixed on my face, watching for lies. "I can explain," I began, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. "This says I own a house. A big house, judging by the property taxes, in Westbrook Hills." She pulled out another sheet. "And this says it's been in my name since I was 4 years old." The soup began to boil over on the stove. Neither of us moved to turn it off. "All these years," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "while I worked double shifts at the diner, while I wore secondhand clothes and skipped school trips because we couldn't afford it, while I watched you count pennies for groceries and worry about the electric bill. There were conditions," I tried to interject. "Your grandmother's will." "Don't." She held up a hand. "Just don't." The silence that fell between us was deafening. The only sound was the hiss of soup burning on the stove. Finally, I reached over and turned off the burner. "I was going to tell you," I said quietly. "On your birthday. I was going to take you there and explain everything." 2 months from now?" She shook her head. "Why not 3 years ago? Why not when Grandma died?" How could I explain that I was trying to protect her, that I didn't want her to know how much her grandmother had despised her, that I feared what the knowledge of wealth might do to her character? "You lied to me my entire life?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was something worse. Disappointed. Betrayed. Her eyes were not those of a child, but of a woman seeing clearly for the first time. "I never lied about loving you," I said, reaching for her hand across the table. She pulled away as if burned. "How would I know? Everything else was a lie." That night she didn't sleep at home. She didn't answer my calls. When she returned 2 days later to collect some clothes, her face was set in lines I'd never seen before. Harder, older somehow. "I'm staying with Jen," she said, referring to her roommate from work. "I need some time." I nodded, respecting her need for space. "We can talk when you're ready." What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that while she was gone, she'd visited a law office. Young and idealistic, she'd walked into Slater and Associates, a firm known for taking on unusual cases. 3 days after she found the property records, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a formal legal notification, complaint for emotional damages and deliberate deprivation. My daughter was suing me for 18 years of lies. They say you don't know what you've got until it's gone, but that's not quite right. Sometimes you know exactly what you have. You just never imagine losing it. That's how it was with Marlene. I always knew she was the best part of my life, but I never thought my attempts to protect her would be what drove her away. The lawsuit hit the local news within days. Small towns thrive on scandal, and ours was no exception. The Millfield Gazette ran the story on page 1. Daughter sues father over hidden fortune. The article was sparse on details but rich in speculation. By noon, my phone was ringing off the hook. Colleagues, neighbors, even the pastor from the church we rarely attended, all wanting to know if it was true. I didn't answer. What could I say? That yes, I'd hidden millions from my only child while she worked herself to exhaustion to afford community college? That I'd watched her skip meals to save for textbooks while a mansion sat empty with her name on the deed? The morning shows came next. I still remember the shock of seeing Marlene on Wake Up America, sitting primly in a blue dress I'd never seen before, her hands folded in her lap like she was at a job interview. "Tell us about growing up, Marlene," the sympathetic blonde host prompted, leaning forward with practiced concern. "We lived very modestly," Marlene began, her voice steady but thin. "I always understood we had to be careful with money. Dad was an accountant, and he taught me to budget from an early age. If I wanted something, new clothes, school trips, even college application fees, I had to work for it. And how do you feel now, knowing the truth? Marlene paused. The camera zoomed in on her face, that beautiful face that looked so much like her mother's. Betrayed, she said simply. It's not about the money. It's about the lie. I could have had opportunities, experiences. I worked 30-hour weeks on top of school. I've never been on a vacation. Never had a new car. Never. Her voice cracked slightly. It just feels like my childhood was stolen. I watched from our small living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand, though it wasn't even noon. Each word was a knife, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. The circus continued. Reporters camped outside our apartment building. I took leave from work when clients began to cancel appointments. My boss was sympathetic but firm. Take some time to sort this out, Harold. Come back when the dust settles. But the dust didn't settle. It swirled higher. 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, I returned home from getting groceries to find my front door ajar. Fear gripped me. Had Marlene come back? Was she hurt? Marlene, I called, dropping the bags in the hallway. No answer. But something was wrong. The apartment felt different, violated. I moved through the rooms, noting small disturbances. A drawer left open, book slightly rearranged. The corner of the living room rug turned up. Then I noticed it. The basement door was open. Our apartment was on the ground floor of an old house with exclusive access to a small basement. I kept a padlock on it, not because there was anything valuable down there, but because of the memories stored in dusty boxes. Memories I wasn't ready to face. The padlock now hung broken on the door. I descended the creaky stairs slowly, flicking on the single bare bulb that illuminated the space. The basement was small and damp, with exposed pipes and concrete floors. Along one wall stood metal shelving units, holding Christmas decorations and old tax returns. Against the opposite wall were the boxes, my boxes, stacked and labeled by year. Someone had gone through them systematically. Lids sat askew. Contents spilled onto the floor. Photo albums lay open, their protective plastic sheets peeled back. Cold dread washed over me. Those boxes contained more than just photos. They held letters, documents, secrets I'd kept even from myself. Frantically, I dropped to my knees, searching for one box in particular. It was pushed toward the back, labeled simply C-2003, the year Catherine left us. The box containing everything I couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring myself to destroy. It was empty. I sat back on my heels, stunned. Gone. All of it. The photos of Catherine that I'd hidden from Marlene because they hurt too much to see. The letters she'd written afterward, explaining herself. The final note she'd left, with its terrible confession and its even more terrible request. If one day Marlene discovers about the house, give her this letter, but only if she still has love for you. If not, let her hate me, because I sold our daughter's soul. Catherine's cryptic words had haunted me for years. I never fully understood what she meant, only that it was connected to my mother, to money, to secrets older than Marlene herself. Now those words were in someone else's hands. I called the police to report the break-in, but their response was tepid at best. Any signs of forced entry, Mr. Mitchell? Anything valuable taken? Just family papers, photos. The officer's expression was skeptical. With this lawsuit going on, sir, it might be hard to prove theft versus family members retrieving personal items. He was right, of course. This wasn't a random burglary. This was targeted. But by whom? Marlene? Her lawyer? Or someone else with an interest in our family's secrets? That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my armchair watching the street through the blinds, jumping at every shadow. Not out of fear for my safety, but fear of what would come next. What would happen when those photos, those letters, that truth came to light? Because somewhere in those stolen papers was a truth even Marlene didn't know. A truth that could hurt her far more than my lies ever had. And now, whoever had taken them could wield that truth like a weapon. The county courthouse of Millfield is an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, built in the 1920s when people still believed justice was blind and impartial. I'd walked past it 1,000 times on my way to work, never imagining I'd one day climb those worn marble steps as a defendant. The first hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November, a preliminary proceeding to establish the parameters of the case. I arrived early, dressed in my only suit, charcoal gray, slightly shiny at the elbows, and sat on a bench outside courtroom C, watching lawyers and clients hurry past with their briefcases and worried expressions. I hadn't hired an attorney yet, partly because of the expense, but mostly because I hadn't decided how to fight, or if I should fight at all. Maybe Marlene deserved to win. Maybe this was the price I had to pay for 18 years of well-intentioned deception. At 9:45, a flurry of activity at the end of the hallway caught my attention. A small entourage rounded the corner, a court reporter, 2 paralegals with document boxes, and at the center, Marlene. She wore a navy blue blazer and pencil skirt, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like a stranger, a professional, determined young woman I barely recognized. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded hallway. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation in her face. But then a man stepped between us, extending his hand toward my daughter with a familiar ease that made my stomach tighten. Dennis Slater. I recognized him from his firm's advertisements on local TV. Injured? Wronged? Call Slater and Associates. We fight for you. In person, he was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with carefully styled dark hair and a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But it was his smile that struck me most. Blindingly white, permanently fixed, never quite reaching his eyes. He leaned close to Marlene, whispering something that made her nod. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned and looked directly at me. The smile widened a fraction. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, crossing the hallway with his hand extended. "Dennis Slater. I represent your daughter in this matter." I stood, accepting his handshake out of reflex. His grip was firm, his palm dry. A practiced handshake designed to establish dominance. "I understand you're unrepresented today?" he continued, his tone dripping with manufactured concern. "For now," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wise decision. Sometimes these things are better handled directly." He lowered his voice. "There's still time to settle, you know. Save everyone a lot of pain and publicity." Before I could respond, the courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called our case number. Slater placed a manicured hand on my shoulder, squeezing slightly. "Think about it," he murmured before turning away, his expensive cologne lingering in the air between us. Inside, the courtroom was nearly empty, a small mercy. Judge Patricia Winters presided, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She listened as Slater outlined the case, his voice modulating between righteous indignation and sorrowful disappointment. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of financial manipulation and emotional abuse," he argued. "Ms. Mitchell was deliberately kept in poverty while her legal inheritance sat unused. The psychological damage of growing up believing you're one paycheck from homelessness when in fact you own a multi-million-dollar estate is incalculable." When my turn came, I spoke plainly. "Your Honor, I was acting under the constraints of my mother's will. If I had given Marlene access to her inheritance before her 18th birthday, everything would have been forfeited to my mother's foundation. I was trying to protect what was rightfully hers." Judge Winters peered at me over her glasses. "And you felt the need to conceal this from your daughter entirely? For 18 years? I hesitated, aware of Marlene's eyes on me. I thought I was doing what was best. The road to hell, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Winters said dryly, "is paved with such intentions." She set a schedule for discovery and testimonies, then adjourned the hearing. As people rose, shuffling papers and murmuring, I tried to catch Marlene's eye, but she was already being ushered out a side door by one of Slater's paralegals. Slater himself lingered, organizing his briefcase with deliberate slowness until we were nearly alone in the courtroom. Then he approached me again, that perfect smile still in place. "Tough day," he said, as if we were old friends discussing a baseball game. "First ones always are." I said nothing, gathering my own sparse papers. "You know," he continued, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, "your daughter is quite remarkable. Resilient, smart. She reminds me of someone I knew once." Something in his voice made me look up. "Who?" The smile flickered slightly. "Oh, just someone from the past." He waved a dismissive hand. "The point is, she deserves better than she got. Don't you think?" I straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I've only ever wanted what's best for Marlene." "Of course you have." His tone was patronizing. "That's what all parents say, isn't it? Even the ones who—" He trailed off, letting the unfinished accusation hang in the air. As he turned to leave, he paused. "By the way, how's Kitty these days?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Kitty. No one had called Catherine that except her closest friends. And me, in private moments. A diminutive from another lifetime. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice barely audible. But Slater was already walking away, that artificial smile still in place. At the door, he turned back one last time. "Your time is up, Harold. This generation wants what's theirs, and they're going to get it." I stood frozen in the empty courtroom, my heart pounding in my ears. How did he know that name? How could he possibly know? That night, I couldn't sleep. Slater's words echoed in my head along with the image of his too perfect smile. I paced our small apartment, feeling the walls close in around me. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just about Marlene finding property records. There was something else at play. Something older and darker than a simple inheritance dispute. I pulled out my laptop and searched Dennis Slater, attorney. Thousands of results. Advertisements, press releases, court cases. I narrowed the search. Dennis Slater background. Fewer results, mostly professional biographies. Harvard Law. Former assistant district attorney. Founded Slater and Associates 5 years ago. Then I tried. Dennis Slater, Catherine Mitchell. No results. But as I stared at the screen, a terrible suspicion began to form. Pieces falling into place like a puzzle I'd been avoiding for years. I needed to know more about Slater. Where he came from. Who he really was. And most importantly, how he knew to call my ex-wife Kitty. Because suddenly I was certain this lawsuit wasn't just about money or lies. It was about revenge. I hadn't been to the mansion since the lawsuit began. Something about Slater's knowing smile, the casual way he'd dropped Catherine's nickname, had thrown me off balance. I felt watched, studied, like a specimen under glass. But 3 days after that courthouse encounter, I found myself driving the familiar route to Westbrook Hills in the dead of night, my headlights cutting through a fine November drizzle. The mansion loomed against the midnight sky, its white columns ghostly in the darkness. I parked a block away out of habit more than necessity, and approached on foot with my collar turned up against the rain. My key slid into the front door lock with a quiet familiarity, the same lock I'd maintained for 18 years, oiling it regularly so it would never stick or squeak. Inside, the house was silent and cold. I didn't turn on the main lights, using only my small flashlight to navigate the grand foyer with its marble floors and sweeping staircase. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness as I moved through rooms that had never known the sound of my daughter's laughter. I'd come with a purpose, to search for anything that might explain Slater's cryptic comments, anything that might connect him to Catherine or to my mother. The mansion had been in my mother's family for generations, and Eleanor Mitchell had been nothing if not a meticulous record keeper. If there were secrets to uncover, they would be here. The study was on the second floor, a masculine room with dark wood paneling and built-in bookshelves. My mother had used it as her command center, running both her social life and her business affairs from behind the massive oak desk that dominated the space. I swept my flashlight across the room, its beam catching dust motes that danced in the disturbed air. Nothing seemed out of place. The desk was clear except for an antique pen set and blotter. The bookshelves held leather-bound classics that no one ever read, arranged by height rather than subject or author. But something felt off. An instinct I couldn't name drew me to the far wall, where an oil painting of my grandfather hung in a gilded frame. It was a grim portrait, Nathaniel Mitchell in his prime, staring down at the viewer with the same cold judgment my mother had perfected. I'd passed this painting hundreds of times over the years, straightening it occasionally when it hung slightly askew. Now I studied it carefully, running my fingers along the ornate frame. There, a slight depression in the wood, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I pressed gently and heard a faint click. The painting swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a wall safe I'd never known existed. My hands trembled as I stared at the small metal door with its combination dial. What would the combination be? My mother's birthday? The year the house was built? I tried both without success. Then, on a hunch, I tried Marlene's birthday. The granddaughter Eleanor had despised. The safe clicked open. Inside was surprisingly sparse. A few jewelry boxes containing what looked like family heirlooms, a bundle of stock certificates, and a single envelope. The envelope was yellowed with age, sealed with red wax impressed with my mother's distinctive EM monogram. On the front, written in her precise handwriting, to be opened only in case of dispute. A dispute, like a lawsuit between father and daughter, I broke the seal with unsteady fingers and pulled out several sheets of heavy stationery. The first page began without preamble, in my mother's unmistakable script. Harold, if you're reading this, then the situation I always feared has come to pass. The truth about Catherine has emerged, or someone is asking questions that threaten to expose it. This letter contains information I've kept from you, not out of malice but out of love, however imperfectly expressed. My throat tightened as I continued reading by the narrow beam of my flashlight. The words swam before my eyes, each sentence more shocking than the last. The letter detailed a meeting between my mother and Catherine 14 years ago, a meeting I'd known nothing about. It described threats, counter-threats, and finally a devil's bargain struck between the two women who should have loved me most. But the most stunning revelation came at the end of the second page. The will that Attorney Keller presented to you was not the original. The document was altered after my death with a forged addendum containing the restriction about Marlene's inheritance. I never intended to separate you from your daughter or force you to live in poverty. The original will, with my true intentions, is held in a sealed envelope with the firm of Blackwell & Hayes in Boston. I sat heavily in my mother's leather chair, the letter clutched in my hand. If what she wrote was true, then the entire premise of our lives for the past 18 years, the secrecy, the separate existence, the lie of poverty, had been based on a forgery, a crime. But who would have altered the will, and why? The answer came in the final paragraphs. I suspect Catherine's involvement, though I cannot prove it. She always wanted control of the Mitchell fortune, and when she couldn't get it through marriage, she may have found another way. Watch for anyone connected to her past, especially from her time in Chicago. Trust no one who knew her then. Chicago. Catherine had lived there briefly before we met. She rarely spoke of that time, changing the subject whenever I asked about it. My mind raced back to Slater, his practiced smile, his familiarity with Catherine's nickname, the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I noticed something else in the safe. A small brass key unlike any I'd seen before. It was old-fashioned, with an ornate bow and a tag attached by thin twine. The tag read simply, "For MCM, Marlene Catherine Mitchell." Another secret, another key, another layer of deception in a house built on lies. As I closed the safe and swung the painting back into place, a sound from downstairs froze me in place. The unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Someone else was in the house. I killed my flashlight immediately, plunging the study into darkness. Straining to hear, I caught the soft footfalls on marble, then the distinctive click of a woman's heels ascending the grand staircase. Not Marlene. She wouldn't know to come here. Not at this hour. I slipped the brass key into my pocket alongside the letter and moved silently to the study door, easing it closed until only a crack remained. Through it, I watched as a beam of light played across the upstairs hallway, moving steadily toward the master bedroom across from the study. The intruder passed my hiding place without pausing, a silhouette I couldn't quite make out. But as they moved down the hall, their flashlight briefly illuminated something that made my blood run cold. A framed photograph on the wall, one that had been stolen from my basement. The week before the final hearing was the longest of my life. After my narrow escape from the mansion, slipping out through a servant's entrance while the intruder searched the master bedroom, I'd gone directly to Boston. The firm of Blackwell & Hayes was still in operation, though none of the named partners remained. A young associate with sympathetic eyes listened to my story and promised to search the archives. 2 days later, I received a call. They had found it, the original will, sealed as my mother had described. The document showed clear differences from the version Keller had read to us. No restrictions on Marlene's inheritance, no cruel conditions. Just a straightforward bequest that would have allowed us to live comfortably together at the mansion from the day of my mother's death. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to separate me from my daughter and keep us both from the truth. And now I knew who. I spent the remaining days gathering evidence. I hired a private investigator, an expense I could suddenly afford now that I'd accessed accounts frozen by the forged will's conditions. The PI worked quickly, delivering a thick folder of documents that confirmed my worst suspicions. Dennis Slater had indeed known Catherine, not just known her, but worked for her. Financial records showed regular payments from an account in the Cayman Islands to Slater's personal account, dating back 5 years. More damning still were the photos. Slater and Catherine meeting at an upscale restaurant in Chicago 3 months ago. Catherine wasn't dead or missing as I'd told Marlene years ago. She was alive, wealthy, and apparently orchestrating an elaborate revenge against me through our daughter. The morning of the final hearing dawned cold and clear. December sunlight glinted off fresh snow as I drove to the courthouse, my evidence carefully organized in a new leather briefcase, a small indulgence after years of forced frugality. The courtroom was packed this time. Word had spread about the Mitchell inheritance case. Local reporters filled the back row, notebooks ready. I spotted familiar faces from the neighborhood, former colleagues, even Marlene's high school principal, all eager to witness the spectacle of a family torn apart. I walked down the center aisle with my head high, ignoring the whispers that followed. At the plaintiff's table sat Marlene, rigid in a charcoal gray suit, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Beside her, Dennis Slater arranged papers with theatrical precision, occasionally leaning to whisper in her ear. Neither acknowledged my entrance. Judge Winters called the court to order promptly at 9. "Before we begin final arguments," she announced, "I understand the defendant wishes to enter new evidence." I rose, conscious of every eye in the room. "Yes, Your Honor. Evidence that will demonstrate this entire case is based on fraud and conspiracy." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Slater's perfect smile faltered for the first time. "Proceed, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Winters directed. I approached the bench, handing over the authenticated copy of my mother's true will. "Your Honor, I've recently discovered that the will presented after my mother's death was fraudulently altered. This is the original document, verified by Blackwell and Hayes in Boston, showing no restrictions on my daughter's inheritance." Judge Winters examined the document carefully, her expression unreadable. Slater was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has had ample time to present evidence during discovery. This last-minute revelation smacks of desperation." "Perhaps," the judge replied evenly, "but if authentic, it's directly relevant to the case before us." She turned to me. "Do you have additional evidence supporting this claim of fraud, Mr. Mitchell?" I nodded gravely, drawing a deep breath. This was the moment, the point of no return. Once these words were spoken in open court, nothing would ever be the same. "Your Honor, I have evidence of collusion between plaintiff's counsel, Dennis Slater, and my ex-wife, Catherine Mitchell, who plaintiff believes is deceased but is in fact alive, and orchestrating this lawsuit." The courtroom erupted. Judge Winters banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Through the chaos, I watched Marlene's face. The shock, the confusion, then the slow dawning of betrayal, not directed at me this time, but at the man beside her. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Winters said when quiet was restored, "these are serious allegations. I'll need to see this evidence immediately." I placed the folder on her bench. "It's all here, Your Honor. Forensic analysis of the forged will, financial records showing regular payments from Catherine Mitchell to Dennis Slater, photographic evidence of their meetings, and most damning, a letter from my mother explaining her suspicions about Catherine's intentions." Slater was ashen now, his perfect facade crumbling. "Your Honor, I object to these unfounded accusations." "Save it, Counselor." Judge Winters cut him off sharply. "I'll review this evidence in my chambers. Court is in recess for 1 hour." As she rose to leave, I turned to face Marlene directly for the first time. Our eyes met across the wooden barrier separating plaintiff and defendant. Hers were wide with shock, filled with questions I'd finally be able to answer. "Mom is alive?" she whispered, the words barely audible. I nodded slowly. "I'm so sorry, Marlene. I thought she'd abandoned us. I never imagined." Before I could finish, Slater grabbed her arm, trying to pull her toward the side exit. "Don't listen to him. This is a desperate ploy." Marlene wrenched free with surprising strength. "You knew?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You knew my mother was alive this whole time?" The courtroom fell silent, spectators frozen in place, witnessing the moment a carefully constructed house of cards collapsed. Slater's eyes darted between Marlene and the exit, calculating. When he spoke, the smooth charisma was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. "Your mother deserved her revenge. After what he did." "What? Who did?" Marlene's voice cracked with emotion. "My father? What exactly did he do that was so terrible it justified lying to me my entire life? Twice." Slater didn't answer. Instead, he gathered his papers with shaking hands and headed for the door. A court officer moved to block his path. "Mr. Slater," Judge Winters called from the doorway to her chambers, "I suggest you remain available. There may be criminal charges forthcoming." As he was escorted out, Marlene collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. I wanted desperately to go to her, to hold her as I had when she was small, but the barrier between us seemed insurmountable, not just the wooden railing of the courtroom, but 18 years of lies and missed opportunities. When Judge Winters returned, her expression was grim. "In light of the evidence presented, this case is dismissed. Furthermore, I am referring Mr. Slater to the Bar Association for ethics violations and to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. Ms. Mitchell," she added, her voice softening slightly, "you appear to be as much a victim in this matter as your father. My sincere sympathies." The gavel fell a final time, sharp and decisive in the hushed courtroom. It should have felt like victory. The lawsuit dismissed. My name cleared. The truth finally revealed. Instead, as I watched Marlene walk out alone, refusing to look back, I felt like a man attending his own funeral. The truth had come too late. The damage was done. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. That day, standing in the empty courtroom while reporters scrambled to rewrite their stories, I realized that sometimes winning means losing everything that matters. Time moves differently for the old and the lonely. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months with little to mark their passing. After the courthouse revelation, I tried to rebuild something from the wreckage. I called Marlene repeatedly, left messages that grew increasingly desperate, sent letters that were returned unopened, even stood outside her new apartment once, a pathetic old man clutching flowers until a neighbor threatened to call the police. Eventually, I understood. Some wounds aren't meant to heal. The mansion was sold 6 months after the trial. Neither of us could bear to live there. Too many ghosts, too many lies embedded in its grand rooms and sweeping staircases. The sale brought a fortune that was promptly frozen when Catherine's lawyers filed their own suits, claiming portions of the estate through obscure, legal loopholes. I didn't fight it. Money had caused enough damage in our lives. Instead, I moved to a modest house on Maple Street, the kind of place we should have been living all along. Comfortable without being ostentatious, with a small garden I tended in the evenings. I retired from accounting, my reputation too tarnished for client work. Besides, I had enough to live on, regardless of how the estate battles eventually resolved. I followed Marlene's life from a distance, through casual mentions from mutual acquaintances or glimpses in the local paper. She finished her degree, not in urban planning as she'd once intended, but in social work. The irony wasn't lost on me. A wealthy heiress choosing to work with society's most vulnerable. Someone said they saw her at Millfield General Hospital, working as a counselor in the children's ward. Another mentioned spotting her volunteering at a women's shelter in the next county. Always helping, always giving, always moving forward, while I remained trapped in the amber of regret. Catherine disappeared after the trial. Her revenge plot exposed but never fully explained. The investigators I hired tracked her to Europe, then lost her trail. Dennis Slater faced disbarment and criminal charges for his role in the will forgery, but the legal proceedings dragged on endlessly, mired in technicalities and delays. None of it mattered to me anymore. The only thing I cared about, the only thing I had ever truly cared about, was lost to me. 3 years passed this way. Quiet, empty years marked only by the changing seasons in my small garden and the gradual surrender to age that comes for us all. My hair turned fully white. My hands developed a slight tremor. My doctor diagnosed arthritis in my knees and prescribed pills that did little except remind me, 3 times daily, of my mortality. Yet every Sunday, rain or shine, regardless of my physical discomfort, I kept a ritual. At precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I would walk to Millfield Park and sit on a particular bench near the duck pond. The same bench where Marlene and I had shared ice cream cones on summer evenings when she was 6 years old. Her small face serious as she concentrated on catching every drip before it reached her fingers. I never expected her to come. The ritual wasn't for her. It was for me. A way to hold on to a memory of happiness before everything went wrong. A quiet penance for the father who thought he was protecting his daughter when he was actually breaking her heart. I kept Catherine's final letter in the pocket of my Sunday jacket, the one found among the papers stolen from my basement, later recovered during the investigation. I'd never opened it. never read the explanations or justifications she might have offered for abandoning our daughter, for orchestrating her elaborate revenge. Some truths are too painful to face, even for a man with nothing left to lose. Every Sunday I would touch the letter through the fabric of my pocket, feeling its edges, wondering if I should destroy it, or if it contained something Marlene might someday want to know. But I could never decide, so it remained, sealed, unread, another secret in a life that had held too many. It was the first Sunday in May, spring finally asserting itself after a stubborn winter, when something changed. I sat on our bench watching children feed the ducks, their excited voices carrying across the water. A pair of elderly women power-walked along the path, bright athletic gear at odds with their measured pace. A young couple sprawled on a blanket beneath a flowering dogwood, lost in each other's eyes. I didn't notice her approach, didn't hear her footsteps on the gravel path or sense her presence until she spoke. "Is this seat taken?" I looked up, squinting against the late afternoon sun, and for a moment thought age had finally robbed me of my senses. Because there she was, Marlene. Older, of course, more poised, but unmistakably my daughter. "No," I managed to say, my voice rusty with disuse. "It's free." She sat beside me, leaving a careful space between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the ducks, the children, the normal life unfolding around us while our own remained suspended in uncertainty. "I've been in therapy," she said finally. 3 years of it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "My therapist says I have abandonment issues." A small, bitter laugh escaped her. "Imagine that." "Marlene, She held up a hand, stopping me. "I'm not ready for apologies yet. I'm not sure I'll ever be." I nodded again, hope withering as quickly as it had bloomed. "But," she continued, her voice softening slightly, "I'm working on forgiveness. Not for you. For me. Because I can't move forward carrying all this anger." She turned to look at me directly, and I saw Catherine in the shape of her eyes, my mother in the set of her jaw, but mostly I saw Marlene. Strong, resilient Marlene, who had somehow survived the selfishness of everyone who should have protected her. "I don't know if we can ever fix this," she said quietly. "I don't know if I want to try, but my therapist thinks I should at least hear your side of the story. The whole truth, no more lies." I felt the weight of Catherine's letter in my pocket, the last piece of the puzzle, unread even by me. "The whole truth," I agreed, my voice barely audible. "No more lies." She stood up then, wrapping her light spring jacket tighter around herself. "Not today. I'm not ready today. But maybe next Sunday. Same time." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even a promise of forgiveness. But it was something I hadn't dared hope for. A possibility. A door left slightly ajar instead of slammed forever shut. "I'll be here," I said, watching as she walked away down the path, her back straight, her steps unhurried. Today, at 73, I still come to this bench every Sunday at 5 o'clock. Sometimes she joins me. Sometimes we talk, careful conversations that skirt the edges of deeper wounds. Sometimes we just sit in silence, feeding the ducks or watching the children play. We're not close. We may never be. But we're not strangers anymore, and that's more than I deserve. The truth, I've learned too late, cannot protect anyone when love has already been destroyed by silence. But perhaps if we're lucky, truth can plant the seeds of something new, something fragile but real, growing slowly in the space between what was lost and what might yet be found. And so I wait, an old man on a park bench holding a letter I may never deliver, watching the sunlight play across the water as another Sunday evening gently fades to dusk. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but what they don't tell you is how lonely that road becomes, how the echoes of your mistakes follow you long after the damage is done. For 18 years I thought I was protecting my daughter. Instead, I was building a wall between us, brick by brick, lie by lie, until we became strangers bound only by blood and betrayal. What would you have done in my place? Would you have told the truth from the beginning, even if it meant exposing your child to a grandmother's hatred? Would you have chosen honesty over comfort, painful truth over protective lies? The hardest lesson I've learned is that when we try to shield others from pain, we often become the source of even greater suffering. The mansion I kept hidden is gone now, but the bench where my daughter and I slowly rebuild what was broken remains. A humble reminder that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. but the courage to face each other with open hearts. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for truth, never too late for a second chance. Even when forgiveness seems impossible, sometimes showing up at the same bench week after week is enough to begin healing what once seemed broken beyond repair. Let me know in the comments what you would have done differently, or if you've ever had to forgive someone who hurt you while trying to protect you.